It gives me great pleasure to introduce for the second session this morning Claire Bishop and Christian Phillip Müller. When we first spoke about this session, having done 1989 in the previous conference, we initially thought that we might end up doing 1993 for this session. It seemed a bit reductive because then we'd have had to invent another year and go on purely by the coincidence of the calendar. So we've extended it much more into the 90s and indeed with general idea into the late 80s and looking at that crossover period between the 80s and the 90s. But 1993 remains an interesting, perhaps a crucial year. We're going to hear from Claire about 3 exhibitions that happened in Chicago, in the south of France, and in the west of the Netherlands, in the east of the Netherlands, which coincided in this year and perhaps began to create the possibilities of a new form of large-scale exhibition in public space, or in a different definition of what public space might be. Claire is the associate professor in the PhD, is associate professor in the PhD program in art history at CUNY Graduate Center in New York, and also visiting professor at the Royal College of Art. And I think she's probably very well known to most of you in the audience for her books, including Participation and Installation Art. It's always a delight to welcome her. And after her, following on immediately, I'm delighted to welcome Christian Phillip Müller, who's an artist who's been exhibiting internationally since the middle of the 1980s, I would say, and has shown in many of the major exhibitions of the last 20 years in Kassel, in the Venice, and in other biennales, but was crucially, for our purposes today, involved in rather different ways in the 3 projects which Claire will talk about. So, without further ado, can I ask Claire to come to the stadium? Thank you very much.
Hello. Good. A couple of things to start with. Just Middlesex and the Centre for European Philosophy. This is an outrage. It's been closed down. So I really urge you all to petition against that. It's one of the very few places where students can study continental philosophy and aesthetics in the UK, because British philosophy departments are increasingly being taken over by Anglo-American analytic tendencies, and this is really lamentable, in my view. Okay, the second thing is that I'm really happy that this is sold out, and it just seems to be unbelievable, because when we first started talking about this, this is a topic for a conference, because this relates to sort of ongoing research I'm doing and a book I'm writing. I thought this was way too specialist, and at the most we might have 20 people in the audience, so it's really gratifying that actually it's full. What else? A note on method. I'm going to be talking about shows that I didn't see. Yeah? So this is going to be a big distinction to the previous panel, and as such my approach is much more of an art historian trying to make sense of things, so it will have none of the frisson of authenticity that you might have enjoyed in the previous panel. And what else did I want to say? So this phrase social turn, which cropped up a couple of times this morning, and which I guess comes from an article I wrote 4 years ago called The Social Turn. What I want to argue in the book I'm writing at the moment is that this is it's actually a return to the social, and that this has happened at various key moments over the 20th century. And in fact, we can demarcate maybe 3 key moments in which an orientation to the social, by which I mean rethinking the artist's role in relationship to society, rethinking the value of participatory art, how we reconfigure this triad of work of art, artist, and viewer, that these have occurred at various moments before, and they occur always at moments of political upheaval. So the first would be circa 1917, when post-revolutionary Russia, when there's a sort of a move towards creating more inclusive and participatory modes of artistic production, especially on the level of theatre and photography. The second moment would be circa 1968, when, as you know, you have the birth of the community arts movement and numerous initiatives by artists globally to try and produce more participatory models of artistic practice. And then the third one I want to propose is 1989. But this one, of course, is more complicated, because this isn't about a moment of revolutionary triumph or its disillusionment, but rather a disappearance, the end of really existing communism, and what that has done to what impact that has had in the political and cultural imaginary. So this is where my research dovetails with the Former West project. Anyway, there's no image up there. Actually, can we have the first image? Yeah. So this is where the research that I'm doing dovetails with Former West, which, as Charles explained this morning, is a project to think through the consequences of the fall of communism for art in Western and Eastern Europe from the 90s onwards. So what I want to... there's no way to put this. So what I want to hope to achieve through some of this research is to provide a sort of an alternative history of the 1990s. Or this is what I hope will come out of Former West as a project as a whole, is that we might get a different history of the 1990s. And what I want to... and for me this stands in contrast to the existing histories of the 90s that we have, and I'm thinking in particular of Art Since 1900, the canonical textbook produced by Krauss, Foster, Buclos, and Bois, which was published in 2004, and which tends to focus on, let's think, identity politics, women artists and the body, large-scale video projection, large-scale figurative photography, and only really in the last chapters did it start to make reference to exhibitions and to more precarious models of artistic production, such as that by Thomas Hirschhorn. So I've got several agendas that I want to sort of funnel through this brief paper. Another one is to track how sort of the way in which a certain impulse of leftist thinking migrates into artistic production after 1989. And I want to argue that this can be seen in the rise of a particular term with which to describe this kind of practice, and this is the project. Now, of course, the project has, this has been used, many decades earlier, for example, around conceptual art, but it becomes the descriptor for the kind of exhibition and artistic practices that engage with the social, in the broadest sense, in art in the 90s. And I think that's apparent already from the papers that we've had this morning, where they're described as projects more than as exhibitions. And for me, the project becomes an umbrella term for rethinking the work of art in relationship to society through various modes, through collective practice, through self-organized activist groups, through documentary film and video, through transdisciplinary research practices, through participatory and socially engaged art, and through the exhibition as a medium. Yeah? All of which of these things are missing in textbooks like Art Since 1900. So this is, again, sort of part of why I want to sort of revisit this material in order to create a different genealogy of work that is more socially and politically pertinent to the kind of interests that are going on now, and which I think are manifest by the fact that this conference is sold out, as is the one that the Hayward and Serpentine are organising today and yesterday in the Purcell Room on the pedagogic turn. And it seems to me remarkable and very reassuring that there's such a swell of interest in this material at the moment. Okay, the only other thing I need to say before I get started is that this is part of a book chapter that also deals with, the kind of things I'm going to be dealing with are in a sort of a part of site-specific exhibition making, the way in which the social gets integrated into site-specific exhibition making in the early 90s. The first half of the chapter will deal with relational exhibition making and performative curating. So experiments that are taking place within the gallery and exhibition, sort of gallery and museum context, but working with the idea of the exhibition as a medium and playing around with those genres. So, for example, I deal with Eric Trancy's early exhibitions and also the show Interpol, curated by Victor Miziano and Jan Aman in '94. Okay, so today I want to focus on a cluster of exhibitions that took place in 1993. Project Unité, not Unité d'Habitation as it's listed in the leaflet, Sonsbeek 93 and Culture in Action, and to a lesser extent maybe Kontextkunst would be the sort of the final fourth one that one would have to deal with if we wanted to deal with these exhibitions as a whole. All three sought to varying degrees to rethink site specificity away from formal and phenomenological models to address a dynamic social context. Two exhibitions, I want to argue, paved the way for this in Europe. So firstly, Caspar Koenig's outdoor sculpture show in Munster. Did I just skip a picture? No, it didn't appear. Okay. Which at that point had existed only in two instalments, 1977 and 1987. And secondly, Jan Hoyt's Chambre d'Amis from 1986, an experimental exhibition in which artists were invited to create installations in over 50 private homes in Ghent. Now, here we are. Here's some pictures of Chambre d'Amis. This is the Bruce Nauman Good Boy, Bad Boy in someone's lounge. That's a Paul Tech installation. Joseph Kossuth, Sol LeWitt, and Bertrand Lavier. Okay. So the artist Christian Philip Müller saw Chambre d'Amis when he was working with Caspar Koenig on the 1987 edition of Münster. 3 years later, Müller and the French curator Yves Aupetit-Taillot visited a housing project by Le Corbusier in the town of Firminy, near Saint-Étienne. Modelled on the Unité d'habitation in Marseille, the building was in a considerable state of disrepair, located at the top of a steep hill on the outskirts of the city, and this was part of its perceived and actual failure, the fact that it was so isolated from the city centre. Its inhabitants were mixed, comprising single parents, students, immigrants, and old-age pensioners. Since 1983, half of the building was empty and boarded up, leaving entire streets of apartments empty and uninhabited, blocked off from the rest of the building by plastic sheeting. Müller suggested to Aupetit-Taillot that it might be possible to hold an exhibition in the building. Each apartment could be taken over by an artist as the site for an installation, on the model of Chambre d'Amis, but now using the uninhabited spaces of an aesthetically and ideologically loaded modernist dinosaur rather than the domestic homes of Ghent. The fact that the building was not entirely empty but a still functioning community meant that the exhibition took 4 years to be realised. In the final show, 40 European and American artists, architects and designers were brought together to assume the role of inhabitants, producing work for 29 empty apartments within this symbolic building. Aupetit-Taillot had hoped to engage the mainly working-class Algerian immigrant residents in discussion with the artists and saw the site as a way to deal with the question of the art world and society, with the building as a perfect frame for this question. In the event, however, most of the artists chose to use the apartment spaces as self-contained galleries. So this is a view of one of the streets, of one of the corridors with apartments leading off it. There's a poster. So here you get the exhibition plan. This is the apartments, and then you can see you can't read it from here, of course, but the names of each of the artists and architects who are within that street of apartments. So a handful of projects directly engaged with the inhabitants of the building. The American artist Clegg & Gutman devised a Firminy music library in which residents lent selections from their music collections, taped and stored them in a cabinet that formed a model of the Corbusier building, each tape placed in a slot that corresponded to the location of the donor's apartment. Martha Rosler's How Do We Know What Home Looks Like was more sociological in spirit, comprising video interviews with residents and statistical information concerning the inhabitants, of the kind that was also produced in Volume 1 of the catalogue. This is a shot of German artist Regina Müller, who worked with some of the children in the building to create doll houses, an allusion to Le Corbusier's concept of the apartment as a playful pedagogic space. Heimo Zomenig converted one of the apartments into a cafe, and this was reportedly the most popular installation in the whole show. Other artists, I think, seem somewhat incapacitated by the request to respond to the site. René Green's contribution, Apartment Inhabited by the Artists Prior to the Opening, that's the title, pondered the problems of being a site-specific nomadic artist and being asked to make work site-responsively. She wore a jacket around the building bearing the word immigration and exhibited this, plus the tent in which she'd slept in the apartment, along with a diary of her time in the building. As this range of works indicate, Project Unité is clearly transitional, but contains a number of aspects that shift European exhibition making into a more socially specific framework. Firstly, its location in a partially inhabited building whose architecture contained the aspiration to a new mode of social collectivity. In this instance, the use of the word project rather than exhibition seems to imply that the totality of the situation, building, residence, artist residencies, was more important than the final production of works for a show. It carries connotations that would accelerate in the 90s, that a project overlaps and engages with the social sphere rather than being at one remove from it, more akin to an architectural project, and which was, of course, a particularly apt point of reference for Firminy. So we can move more swiftly through my other two examples. 1 month after the opening of Project Unité, Sonsbeek 93 opened in Sonsbeek Park in the Dutch town of Arnhem. Unlike Firminy, which took place in a city without a tradition of public art, Arnhem had intermittently hosted an outdoor sculpture festival since 1949. To accompany the 93 edition, its North American curator, Valerie Smith, produced an extraordinarily frank catalogue in which she reproduces her correspondence with the artists, including their failed and rejected proposals. In contrast to the previous edition of Sonsbeek, which had been in 1986, and which mainly comprised large, object-based sculpture, mainly by white male artists from America and Germany, Smith proposed to make an exhibition of work about context-orientated issues and, quote, the individual's relation to the social environment. Although most of the work was sculptural, there are two key projects for our purposes. Firstly, is that going forward? Oh, here's just kind of some of the sculpture work. Miroslav Balka at the top. What's at the bottom? Jan van der Pavert at the bottom there. Okay. Firstly, Mark Dion's intervention in Bronbeck, a museum attached to a royal home for retired veterans, in which he reconstructed display cabinets and filled them with objects selected and arranged by residents of the institution. I know, what's so heartbreaking about all this documentation is how young all the artists look. And then secondly, I think the other one is Irene and Christian Hohenbuchler's self-instituted residency at Arnhem Prison, working with the prisoners to make an installation using their signature materials of wood and fabric, but also painting. The residency built upon, this is a view of the inside this amazing panopticon prison. So the residency built upon their previous collaborations with artists with learning disabilities and led to subsequent projects in 2 psychiatric clinics in Germany. The results of the collaboration, which the artists recall as being very stressful, were displayed in little huts through which one could view through the windows but not enter, rather like the prison itself. So these are the little huts, and that you could look inside and see this kind of work. So Valerie Smith, the curator, was reluctant to label her exhibition as social art or political art because for her, the social denotes, I think, a method or process rather than a goal. Yeah, this is just something I'm trying to deduce from interviews and looking at the material at this time. What does the social mean in relationship to these shows? Because it seems very telling that Smith, when she's interviewed, I should just say that Stefan Dillamuth's contribution to Firminy was to make a video about Sonsbeek, and his contribution to Sonsbeek was to make a video about Firminy. Yeah? And these videos were shown about the construction of the exhibition were shown in the alternate spaces. Of course, rather deftly as works of art, but really good in terms of research for art historians. Anyway, he interviews Smith and he interviews Opetitayo, and it seems really telling that they both say this is not a show about social art. So I'm thinking, what does this mean? What does social mean in 1993 that they want to differentiate themselves? They want to make a distance between what they're doing. Even though they want it to be context specific, they want it to involve local residents, they don't want to call it social art. So I think for Smith, the social denotes a method or a process rather than the goal. And Opetitayo uses exactly the same phrase 3 times when he's interviewed by Dillamuth about Project Unité. And I quote, "The starting point of this project was and is the relation between art and society, but society in a very large sense. It's not only social art or public art." Later, Opetitayo refers to the social as national responsibility rather than specific social groups. Yeah? So I think this is he clearly wants to shift this away from identity politics, but in a very French style wants to make this about national patrimony. And he refers to the Corbusier building as, part of France's cultural patrimony. So it's about drawing attention to the building. So this is what... So I think it's interesting to just kind of prize apart this word, social, and see how it's being used in different ways. And, of course, I think the French context, which Stephanie will talk about this afternoon, will show the social in another iteration again. So I think it's interesting that both curators are reluctant to call their shows social, indicating, I think, the degree of conservatism that was then present in the art world. Prior to the institutionalization of relational aesthetics in the later 90s, any art engaging with the social, i.e. human dimensions of sight at that point, presumably seemed to carry the connotations of agitprop or community art. And this is why I think Opetitayo prefers to link the social to a specifically French project of national responsibility. I'd also like to suggest that Smith and Opetitayo also wish to differentiate themselves from the kind of work being formed in America at this time, and which was about to be labelled by one of its protagonists, the artist Suzanne Lacey, as new genre public art. Now, Lacey was one of 8 artists and collectives who participated in the most ambitious exhibition of socially engaged art, I think possibly to date, Culture in Action, curated by Mary Jane Jacob in summer 1993. It was intended as a critique of Sculpture Chicago, a biennial that had taken place throughout the 80s. Culture in Action built on Chicago's eminent public art tradition as one of the first cities to install a large-scale work in public following the introduction of the NEA's Art in Public Places program in 1967. And this unveiling of the Picasso this was installed in the same year, in 1967. In contrast to this model, Culture in Action deliberately moved commissions away from the central downtown area of Chicago and into marginalized, predominantly low-income neighborhoods. It resulted in 8 projects from a wide cross-section of artists who worked with local community groups over a number of months and even years. Only one of the projects could be said to result in a conventionally sculptural object, Suzanne Lacey's Full Circle, which was a temporary sculpture of boulders with bronze plaques and formed a monument to women in Chicago, both compensation for and a commentary on the fact that no women had ever been honoured in the city's public monuments. Although the work looks like a sculptural intervention in the manner of Boyce's 7,000 Oaks, I think an equally important part of the project was the process of nominating and selecting 100 women to be honoured on the boulders, which was undertaken by an advisory group of 15 women. And then this culminated, as does many of Lacey's projects, in a sort of a ritualised finale, in this case a full circle dinner in September 93. So of the 7 other projects, I'm not going to talk you through all of them. I'm only going to focus on that of Mark Dion, since he participated in all 3 of the exhibitions that I've mentioned so far. In Chicago, Dion worked with a team of 15 high school students drawn from 2 public schools, 1 public and 1 private, on a 3-part project that harbingers, I think, the present decade's fascination with education. I refer you to the Hayward conference that's happening at the moment. So firstly, a rainforest study program with the students in Chicago. Secondly, a field trip to Belize, where the artist had worked a few years previously. And thirdly, the creation of what was called the Chicago Urban Ecology Action Group, based in an experimental field station set up in the Lincoln Park district of the city. Located in a former clubhouse, the field station was intended to operate as an art installation, a workshop, and an ecology information centre in operation all summer long. Each week was themed around topics such as, hang on, I'll give you the just general shots. Here we go. Here's the overview of what was happening each week. Yes, there's a bit, yeah, it is legible. So it's themed around topics such as Darwin, ecology, or classification, and it featured guest speakers, cooking, and tours, while also serving as a hub for the group's community gardening and lagoon cleaning projects. Dion recalls that the response to this, what he calls an eco drop-in centre and clubhouse, was disappointing. Although the group was on site throughout the summer, hardly any visitors showed up beyond the bus tours on Saturdays. And even then, people didn't know how to engage with this kind of process-based art that was participatory and dependent on experience. Today, he suggests, viewers have learnt how to look at this type of project, but in 1993, and I quote him, the art world did not salute this flag. As Dion indicates, this change of approach to exhibition making, embedding artists in the social field with the invitation that they work with specific constituencies, not only changed the artist's relationship to the work of art, which became a set of more or less tuned social relationships, rather than a portable or even a visible object, it also changed the viewer's relationship to seeing art. Joanna Lamoureux has noted how site-specific exhibitions turn the viewer into a flaneur or tourist. And I quote, "The traditional exhibition, complete with its clashes and joys in the places of the works, yields to the journey. As the map substitutes for the picture, the city replaces the museum," end quote. With Culture in Action, I think, even the city seeded and dissolved into social process. As a consequence, the demands placed upon the viewer were even tougher, to the point where the spectatorial position became almost impossible. Christian Phillip Muller recalls the anticlimactic nature of taking the bus tour to see the works. Hours of traffic had to be negotiated in order to see the 8 projects, but there was barely anything to view at each site. Now, the artists Brennan and Sperandio recently got in touch with me when this conference was announced. So I asked them, well, what did people see when they went on the bus tour to visit your project? And I should just say that their project involved collaborating with unionised members of a confectionery plant to design and produce their own candy bar called We Got It. And so the artists recall that their stop on the bus tour took in a display in a supermarket retailing the chocolate with a meet and greet and free gift. Yeah? So what I'm trying to say is that the kind of the type of spectatorial position that develops in relationship to this kind of project working totally reconfigures what we're supposed to be looking at, or even the possible, or how much we get out of looking at something. This is really about, you have to enter into a conversation in order to begin to understand this kind of project. So the emergence of the term project to describe the new social orientation of art emerges with full force at this juncture. Project Unité self-evidently references this shift by referring to its entire enterprise as a project with architectural and process-based connotations. In the Sonsbeek 93 catalogue, Valerie Smith states in her proposal that she would like to include, quote, collaborative projects which would directly question the idea of a single artistic identity and celebrate collective creativity, end quote. Although Mary Jane Jacob doesn't define the term project in Culture in Action, it's her systematic word of choice for the 8 practices that she presented. All 8 are embedded in real social systems, uncertain in their beginnings and endings, and impossible to represent adequately through visual means to the spectator. The inadequacy of the traditional catalogue format to convey such practices is painfully apparent. The photographs of Culture in Action in the catalogue are largely unhelpful illustrations accompanying a series of monographic essays. Their secondary status is indicated all too clearly by this kind of awkward page layout and the fact they take, the designers put these funny little cuts in the pictures as if to sort of reinforce that this isn't art, or it's overlaid with statements. The 2 European exhibitions were more adventurous, I think, in attempting to translate the new attitude into publishing form. In the case of Firminy, this was a research-based approach that was intended to take the form of 5 books, of which only 3 were ever produced. The first volume comprised an architectural history of the Unité d'habitation at Firminy, together with sociological information about its inhabitants, their age, their class, their occupation, and this kind of information, which I think is kind of amazing and sort of very prescient for this kind of transdisciplinary interests of in the social sciences that accelerates in the last decade. The second volume presents the project proposals, while the third shows the realised projects and installation shots, allowing us then to kind of chart the development of these works at various stages of their development. In the case of Sonsbeek, yet more statistics, in the case of Sonsbeek 93, the catalogue took the form of a subjective diaristic journal in which we follow the curator's attempt to communicate her desire for contextually sensitive art to a more or less willing selection of artists. Now, what you can't see on here probably is this kind of letter rejecting Maurizio Catalan's proposal, which is kind of, I think it's, it touches things that I think are completely taboo in today's consensual art world. And then here's a sort of example of this diaristic approach, a kind of photo of Alan Ruppersberg in his studio. She went to meet Cindy Sherman, what was the outcome of that studio visit. Yeah, so you've got this diaristic approach to a sort of charting process. So if my suggestion is correct, and the project is the indicator, this term project is the indicator of a renewed social awareness of artists in the 1990s, this shift is yet to be theorised by art historians and critics. The clearest articulation of the project as a mode of working that I've been able to find lies within another discipline, namely Christian Boltanski and Yves Chiapello's landmark book, The New Spirit of Capitalism, from 1999. In it, they argue that the current spirit of capitalism emerged in the 70s and 80s in response to 2 critiques that came to a head in 1968. The artistic critique, a demand for more autonomy, independence, and creative fulfillment at work, and the social critique, a demand for more parity, transparency, and protection. The key characteristic of this current phase of capitalism, I'm just going to move that onto a blank screen so you can listen to the theory bit without the distraction of images. Okay, so the key characteristic of this current phase of capitalism, they argue, is the dominance of networks and projects, a connectionist world in which fluidity and mobility are the most esteemed values. Although Boltanski and Chiapello draw their conclusions from a survey of management literature from the past 30 years, many points in their analysis sound like a description of the contemporary art world, and even more specifically, that of the post-studio, site-responsive artist and the roving global curator. They describe today's working life as a succession of projects based on successful connections with others, giving rise to a universe of value that they call the projective city. What is valued and gives status in the projective city is the ability to be adaptable, flexible, and intellectually mobile. As such, they argue, a career today consists not in filling vacancies, but engaging in a multitude of often very heterogeneous projects. Significantly, in the projective city, a successful project is not one that has intrinsic value, but is one that allows you to integrate yourself into a new project afterwards. In other words, a project that is generative of further projects through the connections you've made. Yeah? I mean, I think the relevance of this for the contemporary art world is kind of obvious. So it should be emphasised that Boltanski and Chiapello are critical of this trend, since the valuation of flexibility privileges those without ties, familial, health or otherwise, and exploits those who lack such social and geographical mobility. It's also significant for our purposes that they account for this situation as the internalisation of the artistic critique from 68 at the expense of a largely abandoned social critique. This is not the place to go into their recommendations for what they suggest for addressing this balance. What I want to suggest here is that the rise of the project in contemporary art is exactly synchronous with the developments that Boltanski and Chiapello outline. What is intended in art as a radical overhaul of the portable work of art and its lack of social agency is at the same time an internalisation of the 60s logic of post-studio and post-medium specificity that comes to prioritise personal qualities of interaction rather than the production of objects. Personality traits such as adaptability, nimbleness, creativity and risk come to replace the production of visually resolved works. Yeah, so sorry, I garbled that a little bit, but yeah. So personality traits become more important in the project than your ability to produce kind of visually coherent or resolved pieces. So frequently, there is no object as such to look at as the result of a project. Inevitably, when these new process-based modality is put into conjunction with old formats of display like the exhibition, I think there's a conflict between these models. And so what I'm trying to argue is that all of these attempts to sort of move the kind of practices that we were shown this morning that were happening in a sort of a more localized, self-generated way, when these then become curated by institutions, there's a tension between this kind of process-based modality of the project and this kind of desire to fix it and give it visual identity. So experimental exhibitions like Culture in Action, while striving to democratize the production and reception of art, are also, in an important sense, profoundly unequal, since they privilege those who don't need to be mobile. Those who experience the project and can participate in it are those who can spend the most time on site. Whether this is a positive move, as a kind of act of decelerated spectatorship, that you need to be present repeatedly in order to understand the project, or a refusal of the traditional model of audience, I think is a matter of debate. What I want to point out is that the desire to place projects into an exhibition format, indeed to start conceiving of the exhibition as a project, is symptomatic of the early 90s, when curators try and reconcile a desire for more participatory modes of production that preclude spectatorship with more conventional models of display in which spectatorship is assured and stable and provided. So finally, I just want to end by thinking about why the exhibition becomes this, this charged site in the 90s, which of course is also to do with the kind of institutionalization of curating as a vocational programs in academic institutions. But I think it's also to do with a kind of changed idea of what the exhibition is at this time. So Boris Groys has written that advanced art today, which interestingly he summarizes as installation art and experimental curatorial practice, he argues that these do not ask us to look at objects in a certain space, but allow space itself to become the major object of perception. In contrast to unidirectional modes of spectatorship, such as rock concerts and cinema, he argues that installation and experimental curating exhibit us as viewers as much as the objects, and thereby compel us to reflect on our own position and perspective. As such, he argues, and I quote, "Art today is thus social and political on a purely formal level because it reflects the space of the assembly, the formation of community, and does so independently of whether or not an individual artist has a specific message in mind." So I want to argue that this is too broad a claim. It's not true that all exhibitions, by virtue of simply being a place of public assembly, have social and political currency. The kind of exhibitions I've been presenting to you also put this idea under pressure, since I think they problematize the idea of unified spectatorship. And I say, whether or not this is a radical move or a regressive one remains open to question, and perhaps it's one that we can discuss. And I think this problem reinforces the paradox of participatory art in general, that the more participatory the work, the more it forecloses spectatorship, and the less open it is to future audiences. So I'm going to end there and just show you a 3-minute clip of Stefan Dillermuth's video of Project Unité at Firminy, because I think it's best through exhibition history is actually quite well captured through video and this kind of mode of documentary. And this clip comes right at the end of his documentary, and I have to say it really wounded me when I first saw it, because you'd been looking at this building and the quiet spaces and the artists thinking about what they were going to do in these spaces. And the clip I'm going to show you is the opening and the arrival of people the arrival of the art world basically into these domestic spaces. And I think it's revealing as a snapshot of what happens between these multiple audiences. So if we can roll the video, that'd be great. Thank you.